All right, so thank you everyone for coming out today, and thank you to...
Do you need this?
No, do you hear me? Can Joy, is that okay with the video or no?
We're good. I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. And thank you to Joy Yaggett, who, among many talents, is recording today for Soma TV. So welcome to the first annual presentation from the Maplewood Community Board on Police. We're going to talk about the past year and our work. And thank you. The big part of our work is to engage as a community, whether it's a community of residents, a community of people who work and visit Maplewood, and also our officers who work here as well. So thank you, everyone, and we're going to kick it off.
Should we introduce ourselves?
We're next up.
That's the next thing. Yeah.
So today we're going to cover a few topics. We're going to introduce ourselves very briefly. We'll talk about the history of creating the board. We'll go over the charter, which is the ordinance that founded the board and governs our work. We'll talk a bit about the objectives we set for 2019. We're going to deep dive into some topics, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. And yes, we're going to get this done by 3:30. So next up, so meet the board. My name's Erin Scherzer. I, along with Kasha Picards, are the co-chairs of the Community Board on Police. And I thought maybe start Kasha, go down the line, introducing.
Sure. So one thing you'll find out as we talk about the charter and how the board was developed and those sorts of things, that the board has 3 seats for members of activist communities who were all part of the creation of the board. So I sit on the Soma Justice seat, and as Erin said, I co-chair the board with her.
Dean Daffis, welcome everyone. Deputy Mayor in Maplewood and government liaison to the board.
All right, sorry, we should probably explain. So there are 7 voting members of the board, and then we have government liaisons and a handful of others who sort of sit. They don't vote on anything, but they sit as part of the meetings and contribute.
So the short of it is Dean doesn't vote, but he's a very important member in terms of building our relations. So as I mentioned, I'm co-chair with Kasha. I'm in this community coalition on race seat. We were one of the 3 organizations that helped bring the board to place. We have Julie here.
Hi, I'm Julie Fry. I sit in one of the community seats on the board.
Michael Ferris. I have the Soma Action seat. I've lived in Maplewood for about 20 years.
Susan Berkeley, I also have one of the community seats.
Greg Lembrick, I'm on the Township Committee, and I'm, along with Dean, one of the liaisons from the Township to the Community Board.
Albert Sally, Deputy Chief, Maplewood Police Department, liaison between the Police Department and the Community Board of Police.
And we have 2 other people, Ann Grodman, our board attorney, and Glenn Mikowski.
Hi, today is tech guy.
No, Glenn is more than the tech guy. Glenn is our business administrator, township administrator representative, and is our liaison on the administrative arm. We have 2 other voting members, one Manny Hernandez, who could not be here today due to a conflict, and Paul Williams, who will be joining us shortly from his daughter's birthday party. So.
And importantly, as part of sort of the education of what we're doing, it's part of what we're trying to do here. We mentioned that Ian Grodman is our board attorney. Not every, board for the township has an attorney, but a lot of the things that we do are sensitive and require really careful thought about what we're allowed to see, what we're allowed to do. So it's really important that we have somebody, sort of esteemed member of the community who's also and has a law degree and can help us make sure that we're not misstepping at any point.
Okay, so the history of the board, there's a really nice timeline up there that you can follow. The board was created in response to the events of July 5th, 2016, in which police camera footage and audio recordings revealed members of the Maplewood Police Department using force against local teens of color who were herded out of town on the biased presumption that they must have been from Irvington or Newark. One of the teens, in fact, was kicked repeatedly in the head while handcuffed on the ground. The release of the video and the audio from the incident didn't come until late summer of 2017. More than a year after the incident, the information was locked in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. But once it was released, understandably, the public outcried and protested and called for reform. called for police accountability and transparency, called for implicit bias training, called for the resignation of the police chief, which happened shortly thereafter, and called for greater efforts toward community policing. So social justice advocates, at the time I was one of them on the ground. I had not been elected yet, but we all got together along with the elected members of the governing body and other community groups to talk about a civilian review type board and what would that look like for a suburban community such as ours. And as far as we know, we believe that what we have today is the only one of its kind in New Jersey. After a new police chief was appointed in early 2018, and we are graced with the presence of that chief, our chief, Jim Duvall. Thank you, Chief, for being with us today. Our board charter was created, comprised, as Kasia stated earlier, of community group members who were involved, social justice advocates, law enforcement liaisons, and elected officials liaisons. A charter was developed, the board was created by township ordinance, as you see there on the timeline, and in late fall of 2018, the inaugural members were appointed and began their work toward reinventing community police relations in Maplewood.
And that basically brings us today. So we've had a year of working through, or a year to start. And
So I will speak briefly about the ordinance that created the board because we are an arm of the government, and so our power comes through by legal authority through the Township of Maplewood. So it's important that we comply with the laws that set up our board. So we'll talk a little bit about what our board does, and then equally important what we don't do. Because when you hear the term civilian board or community board on police, it can mean many different things, and different models have been tried in different parts of the country and even tried within our own state. So here's the Maplewood take on this. So first and foremost is our charter, which is this. Let's say we bring this out a lot in meetings, so it's a little wrinkled. So we want to make sure we stay within the confines here. We have a process. Some of it is operating procedures in terms of how meetings run, how board members are appointed, that whole, if you love corporate governance, there's a lot in there for you. But outside of that, this is our founding document in terms of the principles of why this board was created. It was created for transparency. It was created to bring us all together as a community, not just the residents who live here, people who visit and work here, but also our governing body, and also equally important, our law enforcement officers, and from the top to the person who was just hired, I'm sure a few weeks ago. It's for all of us to work together on these changes, and we've been appreciative that everyone has been coming together, so thank you to everyone. This also, part of our charter is for us to create a workflow in terms of obtaining documents. We actually had an extra level of scrutiny on us. So under all of the documents that the police have are government records, and through government record requests, you can ask for them. Because of certain state laws and general practice in terms of access to, let's say, personnel information, and then above all, being sensitive that the matters that our law enforcement officers respond to are incredibly sensitive, incredibly personal. I mean, they see people at a time when they are most vulnerable, and to protect individual resident and visitor privacy, we have a whole workflow in terms of how materials are redacted before it comes to us. So we don't know names, we don't know where you live, we don't know any of that information. All we know is that the age, the demographic, your age, your race, and gender. That's it. Those three categories, both on the civilian side and the officer side. We have multiple.
actually less on the officer side.
Well, actually, even less on the officer side. We just know
That there was an officer.
the officer race and gender is all we know on the officer side. And so in terms of the review, we have a process in terms of requesting. So first the request comes from the board to Deputy Chief Sally. DC Sally pulls that information from all different parts of the department. Then, after he makes sure it's redacted, it goes to our board attorney, Ian, so we have another layer of filter. Ian reviews, they talk shop on different things, and then it comes our way. And even that way, not all of us have access to different documents. So a long way of saying is we're trying to protect the confidentiality of the process. So our overall objective for the board, a couple things. One is we're looking at data to see trends that can improve training, could improve programs, and it can improve policies for the department. We're also trying to look at trends in the community and how we can better educate the community on us being better global citizens in terms of how we police each other and police ourselves. And above all is we want to be a trusted resource for the community to come to us if you spot something that seems off, to let us know. And we have different channels that we'll talk about later and how to reach us. So what we don't do, we can't make laws, we can't make rules, we are strictly advisory. So our goal is to build positive relations with the police department and the town so that we're able to bring community concerns and make change. We do not participate in anything related to personnel, anything related to internal affairs. We're prohibited by law to do so, and so we are focused on research and programming, and that's what it is. And last but not least, we do not breach confidentiality. We all have signed a confidentiality non-disclosure agreement, and on top of that, I think a bit of fear of God was put into a lot of people about not releasing or talking about things, and we take that very seriously. So those are a little bit on what we don't do. And Kasha later, due to tech issues, will show you where to find all this information on our website.
That is the appropriate link. All right, so we have the charter, we have all the history behind us, and then we kicked off in January. So we're going to talk a little bit about what our objectives were for the past year. And after that, then we'll go and, we'll address a handful of those topics in more depth. So the first half of the year was actually just us figuring out what is going on. So we didn't set ourselves any real goals except to dig in deep, read the policies, do department tours, do ride-alongs, think about what topics we may want to address more specifically, start taking a look at the data, really understand what's happening at the department before we decided what to do. So we really, we spent most of the first half of the year doing that. And then in June/July, we got together and said, okay, we've done that initial set of information gathering. Of course, there is still lots and lots of information to be reviewed and gathered, but at least we had our initial set behind us. And we agreed on a handful of areas to focus on. One was use of force, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics here, because we'll talk about the background as to why we selected some of these topics in a second. Use of force, non-emergency calls, stops, training, I think is an obvious one, obviously coming out of the charter. Constituent outreach has always been a topic, and sort of thinking about how we can better, communicate with the community specifically, but also with the police force. School drills and restorative justice. So we have a handful of things that we've addressed when it comes to the schools, and we can talk about that later if anyone's curious about that. And then finally, everything that Erin just described in terms of our document protocols and all of that sort of thing. It was an intensive process just to figure out exactly how we were going to unveil all of those things. So that was a key part of our objectives this year. So with that, we're going to focus on 5 specific topics to go a little bit deep on. Erin's going to talk about use of force, and then Dean and Susan are going to talk about non-emergency calls. Michael and I will talk about stops. Julie's going to talk about training, and then I'll talk a little bit about constituent outreach, including a favor we have of you all in the room.
Okay, so use of force. So with each of our topics as we go along, there'll be a why we investigated. I'm not going to read slides, but 2 key reasons why we're looking at force, use of force. One, of course, the significance of the harm. We can have grave lifelong injury and the impossibility of death in the case of some circumstances. It also it creates a fear factor in particularly communities of color, so it's important that we address and understand how force is being used and when it's not being used. Also, there was a community call to action, as Dean mentioned earlier, in terms of after the July 5th incident in 2016, looking at force within our department, and then after the New Jersey Star Ledger issued the force report last December, so December of 2018, I guess 2 Decembers ago, December 2018, where they examined all 300 municipalities within the state. There was a call at our community forum last year to look into the force information. To set up a dialogue on force, I want to lay some ground rules first. One, we need to understand the state mandate and state rules in terms of using force. Our police department, in terms of New Jersey's structure, for those who are not aware, the power given to our police department starts with the New Jersey Attorney General's office. Attorney General overall is the chief law enforcement officer. He or she, hopefully one day we get a female AG, that individual sets the policy in terms of what force is used, any form of law enforcement policy, and we must comply with state law. So this long paragraph, which is, I know a lot of text here, but I wanted to, I'll briefly summarize what it says. Basically, force should not be routine. There's actually exact language in there that force is not routine. It's the extreme exception to the norm. And specifically, it's this quote, "It's the policy of the state of New Jersey that law enforcement officers will only use the force which is objectively reasonable and necessary." So assessing the situation, using just enough force to be able to control the situation, but not too much. But of course, above all, we're trying to avoid force generally. So let's talk a little bit about the state actual requirements. So there are many different requirements on the state level with respect to force. They define what force is, the different types of force, and at the end, if you're curious, I actually printed out the AG's policy. So if you want to read, talk a little bit more, or have specific questions on type, happy to discuss at the end. So the state policy on reporting, so this is an officer in the field, what they have to report. They shall, and I'll get into distinguishing on language in a little bit, shall report on physical force, mechanical force. So mechanical force would be like a baton, a taser, something like that, or deadly force, which is obviously a gun. So the Maplewood requirements is everything you see on the state level plus, and I want to emphasize the plus, because as a department, through our research and spending a lot of time in the police station, that they take this very seriously, and we are one of the few departments that actually require additional categories for reporting. So one, this is all required. So whereas on the state level it's shall, so let's say I shall go to the gym later, I shall take care of the pile of laundry sitting in my home office that needs to be folded, shall, it's required. Officers here will be disciplined if they do not complete this form. On top of that, in addition to those categories, believe it or not, physical force, mechanical force, and deadly force do not include a situation when an officer draws his or her weapon. Not shoot, like pull the trigger, but when he or she pulls their weapon out of the holster. In Maplewood, we require anytime a gun is unholstered, that be reported. It's called constructive authority, and the police department wants to track when guns are being pulled out and when they're not. So if an officer pulls the gun and doesn't report, that's a problem. So in terms of what we looked at, so the force report, for those who didn't see it, please go to the Star Ledger's website, review their document. One thing I also want to note, force is legal. Force is officers are allowed to use it. The question is it justified? Is it right for the situation? And it's not. That's where the challenge arises. So we took a look at the force from 2017, 2018, and 2019 because the force report stopped at 16. So what you see here is across the line the number of incidents. Now, incidents can involve a couple of officers using force during those instances, which I will discuss in the next slide. But I think it's clear to understand how many overall number of instances our police officers respond to in a year. As you can see, probably about 21,000 to almost 22,000 in a year. And the number of those instances that actually involve force. So it's important to understand that this is not an everyday occurrence within Maplewood. That said, one bad incident 1 Eric Gardner, 1 Amadou Diallo, 1 Sandra Bland, we can go down the list of names, is 1 too many. So it's important that we have the checks in place, we have the training in place, and we have the protocol for addressing the situations. So the next level down here, So the next level here, force also breaks into 2 types of categories. So when we reviewed the data, police respond to force in many different situations. The image we have that comes to mind, right, is the show Cops, right, where we see them taking someone down or using the taser or whatever. But our officers can use force in situations where they need to use a compliance hold, and I'll ask DC Sally if you can explain what a compliance hold is.
So we, as police officers, we try to verbally stop somebody or have them comply to what we're doing. We don't jump to force. So we receive a lot of training where we try to talk, and we use a lot of use time on our side. So I always tell the guys, use patience. Take your time. Hopefully we can talk and have the person just comply. But sometimes people don't comply. People are not happy about being arrested, or they just don't want to go. So we use compliance holds. Compliance hold could be grabbing somebody's wrist or locking their arms to get them to comply, and it's usually used for handcuffing. So we're trying to get the arms of a person, and we're trying to handcuff them, so a compliance hold would be put pressure on their wrist or their arms to effect an arrest.
Thank you, DC Sally. So sometimes when those compliance holds are used are in the situations that you see in gray. Our police officers they not only respond to crime, they also respond, they're first responders, and respond in medical situations. So thankfully, we have a crisis management team within our community, and the police officers are one of the actors within that. And sometimes social workers and those who are trained to make behavioral decisions have determined that someone is either a threat to themselves or a threat to others. We're talking mental health situations. And so they don't want to go to receive treatment. And so in those cases, the officers may have to cuff the person to get them onto a gurney to get them to where they need to go. Nevertheless, they still need to fill out a force form, which is why you see one here. But I wanted to give the balance, so you need to understand that it's a little more than just hot pursuits. So a little bit of what our investigation into the data showed. So what we looked at the actual use of force form, and then the underlying incident report. So with everything that happened, those 20,000 incidents, there's like some sort of long 5-page document that gives the narrative that the police officer writes as to what happened, whether it's a traffic accident or an incident where they have to arrest someone. So what we found in reviewing the information, that per incident, there's about 2 or 3 officers within that scenario who use some sort of force. That can be maybe 2 or 3 there was a larger person they had to take down. It took two officers to control the individual to cuff them. It could be a situation where the force was used in the field, and then when they bring the individual to the police department, the individual there's a problem there, and they need to be able to get the person to either sit on the bench or go into the cell or whatever it is. So force is used in those particular, but it's still one incident. Overwhelmingly, most of the force incidents involved in black male individuals. This was larger than any other category. Just so you know how race is determined, it's in how the officer sees race. So there were quite a few, I'd say like maybe 2 or 3 incidents where one officer would say the person was black, one person would say they were white, and so in coding we put that as unable to determine race. So it's hard. I mean, you're looking at someone and making a determination, but above all that, most incidents of force were used against black male individuals. The most common type of force used was the compliance hold, which DC Sally described, but there were other instances where guns were drawn, never fired, but drawn. In those cases, most were cases where the individual either presented a weapon first, or the call came in that the person was, let's say, on the run and armed and dangerous, and so the officer approached. There were a couple cases where the officer, back in 2017, where they would go into a setting, like in a house, and they were trying to assess what was going on, and weapons were drawn in that particular case. Above all, the biggest takeaway of looking at all this information is that examining paper is not it's insufficient analysis to be able to actually examine what's happening in force. Paper doesn't talk. Paper doesn't tell you what led up to the force that happened there. It doesn't tell you anything about officer demeanor that may have upset someone. It doesn't tell you, what other factors were going on. So the best way to do is to actually look at video, which we started to do toward the end of the year once we got a handle on the actual paper data that came our way. So the steps going forward will be to, one, I want to talk about what the police department does in terms of reviewing force and our work in that. So every use of force form that comes in, Deputy Chief Sally is reviewing that data. Like, if the form comes in, he's looking at not just the data, but the video, which is, as you mentioned, body cam and dash cam and other types of camera footage. Also, just so you know, within the police department, I don't know if anyone's taken a department tour, I know they had some in the spring, there are cameras every point where a civilian will come into the department. So where the car pulls in, called the Sally Port, there's cameras there so you can see what's happening there. You can see when they're processing the person, there's cameras there. There's cameras in each cell. This is a way that we can, as a community, can make sure that there's no funny business that's happening behind there.
Also, our body cameras are rolling the whole time.
Yes, and the new policy is, it was interesting looking at the old incident reports. There's times where the officer said, I had to flee, so I had to pursue someone who was fleeing, so I didn't have time to turn my body camera on. Now the department policy is, it's on. Yeah, unless you keep it on all the time. So there's a lot of, so basically DC Sally is looking at all instances involving force. One of the questions we had when we started to investigate the department is, so what happens if someone doesn't fill out the form, right? Like, it's pretty easy, the state requirement is shall, and there's 20,000 incidents. It's pretty easy not to fill out a form. So now the department is actually spot reviewing other, non-use of force situations just to make sure there's internal compliance. Now that we've gotten through 17, 18, and 19, we would love to have seen more video. The challenge is our server system only holds things for 90 days. So now our practice will be about monthly. We'll be meeting in the department to review video and go through the force data. Our hope is to be able to address some of the potential racial disparities. I use the word potential because we don't know. We can't draw an inference from a piece of paper as to what actually happened in that situation. It's to evaluate, okay, so if we have an intoxicated person who is a white female, an intoxicated person who is a black female behind the wheel, same situation, what was the approach in, and being able to evaluate the approach in those different situations. So that's the hope of what's to come ahead. I think.
Right. As far as the board reviewing the body cam photos, it's not me telling them which ones to review. So they get the use of force report, they get the incident report, they review that, and then they tell me which ones they want to review. So if they see something they have questions about, they'll contact me and they'll request to see that video of that report, and then we come in and check.
They come in and review things from there.
Okay. So the next category is the non-911 police calls, and I want to make sure everybody understands this. We certainly do not want to miseducate or misinform or confuse the public here. For emergencies, people should always call the police. For 911 emergencies, that doesn't change. What we wanted to focus on were the non-emergency calls into the police, because there are a lot of calls that are made to the police in non-emergency situations. And we wanted to figure out two things there. Was there any racial bias in some of those calls? And is it possible to redirect some of those calls to appropriate township departments, especially when the calls do not relate to any policing matter, right? And we took a look at the calls in 2018. There was about 900 calls, 900 non-emergency calls made. And something that we should let the public understand here is also that all calls that are received by dispatch have to be responded to, right? We're gonna get to some questions in a little bit. And I'm glad there's questions, that's great. So we looked at different categories. One of the biggest categories of calls, non-emergency calls into the police, are so-called suspicious persons calls. This is when someone calls and says, hey, I see someone I don't recognize outside, can you check it out? Or they, or whatever they're doing outside, looks suspicious to me. Or I see someone in a vehicle parked outside of my car, I don't recognize the person or the vehicle. Or I see someone in the park, etc., etc. And I'm sure a lot of you here, or some of you may, have seen a lot of these sorts of discussions related to these calls in social media as they relate to things that were reported on in Maplewood. So in 2018, of the 900 or so calls that the police received, 243 of them were suspicious persons calls. And of those calls where race was identified, 73% of those calls related to a person of color. So again, as Aaron mentioned, this is what we saw in the reports of all the calls that were logged. We can't say with certainty, but certainly there is an appearance of bias here. And what we also saw that, it says there, among those calls where race was identified, it was 3 times as likely to be black or Hispanic. And none of those calls led to an arrest. Again, the police responded, investigated, and there was nothing illegal or suspicious or criminal or of a public safety threat to the community.
Dean, can you tell us a little bit about what was viewed as suspicious behavior in documents that you and Susan reviewed?
Right, and that brings us to this thing, which I hope everyone will get a copy of on your way out. This is a flyer, an educational flyer that we created that sort of walks people through some of these slides. The calls were about normal activity that everybody does. Sitting on a bench in the park, jogging down the street, sitting in your car, making a call, or looking for directions, waiting for a bus at the bus stop, or stopped on the side of the road to look for directions, or hosting a party during permissible township ordinance times, 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. in Maplewood, but, so the idea here is we want people to look out for their neighbors always. We're a very community-minded town, but we want people to be vigilant, but we do not want people to be paranoid. And there seems to be some, bias and some paranoia here motivating some of these calls. So the other reason why we investigated this is oh yeah, Susan, do you want to jump in? Jump in.
No.
Tag you in.
Yeah,
Sure,
the
so
redirect.
no problem. We
Yeah.
wanted to create a resource to help people take a minute before they call the police, because we realize that the force and everything else that you're reacting to, the police are reacting to because we as a community are calling them in to these incidents. So before making that call, take a minute to think, if you were doing that, would you think that someone should call the police on you? When I looked at some of the reasons for these calls, it's pretty shocking, and I don't think that you would necessarily see someone making a call on a lot of people sitting here for those same activities. And also things like downed trees, my neighbor left acorns on my driveway, kid you not. Lots of little things where it really seems like you could pick up the phone and contact your neighbor first before involving the police, to do a better job ourselves as a community of understanding, particularly for non-911 calls. We're not saying if you see something that seems like an emergency not to call 911, but to involve police for a lot of these matters doesn't seem like it's necessarily the right course of action. A comment was made before the meeting that you can't call the Department of Public Works, before 8 a.m., after 10 p.m., and that is completely fair. Because we are trying to direct people to the right places to call. By all means, still call the police if you feel that you can't get in touch with the right department during an off hour, but hopefully during business hours, you can get to the right office and get the right people to come and address it, and our police can have the time to be dealing with the issues that they should be dealing with.
And I will say that email is 24 hours, and it's a great way to communicate and document any pothole concerns you may have or unshoveled sidewalks, because there may not be a phone record, but there certainly is an email one.
Right. And there are a lot of calls being made to the police that concern neighbor-to-neighbor disputes that could be handled with your neighbor, at least at first pass. Bushes overgrowing on the side of your property, or property maintenance concerns, trash not being taken out, or trash, invading your property. These are the kinds of things that we can deal with through our code enforcement department. We have very robust and active code inspectors in town. We encourage everyone to call them for those kinds of things. We encourage people to call the Department of Public Works as well with respect to some of these property maintenance issues, instead of calling the police, because the idea here again is when police get involved and subject members of the community to that, it can get escalated. It can become confrontational unnecessarily. And on the back end, after it's all done and the police go away, you have done what? You have ruined your relationship with your neighbor now. And it is forever confrontational, and that does not add to tighter and stronger community.
And I think that goes to parked car situations also.
Right.
The volume of calls made on a legally parked car that was just in a neighborhood that wasn't recognized, or someone pulled over to make a call or text or do something. A lot of that could probably pass in 5 minutes, and the person is in the car, it's not an abandoned vehicle, something wrong, because there were a number, people care about each other here, there were a number of doors open on this person's house, or a light is on inside car door is open and no one is there. Fine, that concern is excellent, but the number of calls made on someone just in their car doing something legally parked, and then the police have to come, check that out, why is that car there, and there was absolutely no foul play, no reason for that call, was very, very high, and isn't a great use of resources.
But when in doubt, call the police. I mean, if it's that gray area, we're not too sure about,
That's always our overriding theme, because I was yelling, people shouldn't be calling for any of these reasons. And he said, no, not exactly. A lot of the reasons are legit. Don't tell people not to call, but to get people to think for a second before making that call.
Yeah, I think Erin and Susan said it really well. This idea of just reflecting for a minute before you make that call to the police. So, there was one scenario where a woman of color was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk outside in front of someone's house. She was on a call for work and was literally pacing, as I do when I'm on my cell phone, by the way, back and forth outside of this person's house, and this person called the police on her. Again, nothing suspicious or criminal. So it's this idea of reflecting a little bit, and if upon reflection and you take a moment to step back, you really are concerned, then by all means, of course.
So, now we're going to move on to stops. I'll introduce the topic.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Because it hasn't been said, I just want to begin by mentioning my own view that since the incident, since the change in leadership in the department, I don't know if I speak for others, but I feel like the leadership of this department has demonstrated a deep commitment. Right? I feel like the leadership of this, can you hear me? Leadership of the department has demonstrated a deep commitment to professionalism and transparency. So we couldn't really know what we know and ask the questions we're asking without those commitments. So I just want to commend the leadership from the top and the people we've dealt with, particularly DC Sally, but for being willing to engage and work with us and have the conversations. Okay, So this aspect of our work is in its earlier stages. We're not as far along with this as we are with some other of the areas. And I just want to make a few general comments. I mean, why are we concerned about this? And I think we can distinguish two kinds of issues, two kinds of questions when it comes to stops, and particularly traffic stops. What is the level of engagement or intrusion or investigation, like how much activity is going on? And that's one question. Is it the right amount? Is it too much? Is it too little? Why is it being done? What are the goals? A separate question is the question of racial disparities. And if there are racial disparities, do those disparities raise any concern about racial discrimination? Because disparities don't necessarily mean discrimination, although they might raise that question. So we're interested in those two broad issues. I'm not going to go into the Fourth Amendment and what the Supreme Court has said about traffic stops. The courts have given the police a great deal of discretion when it comes to these stops. Under law, they need a reasonable, articulable basis for any traffic stop. They have to see a violation or have some other information that leads them to have reasonable suspicion that some violation of law is going on. I just want to flag one concern or question, and I'll turn it over to Kasha to tell us more about the specifics of where we're going with this. But research around the country has documented that there really are de facto two kinds of traffic stops. There's a book that deals with Kansas City, Missouri, where about 700 motorists were actually surveyed and interviewed in person. And you can imagine two ideal types. One is the clear traffic violation. Someone is going through a radar-enforced area at 15 miles an hour with the speed limit. Somebody blows through a stop sign. Somebody is driving so erratically that there's a DWI concern. These are clear violations of the traffic laws, and it's traffic enforcement. But there's another kind of stop that is more about investigating for further crime. And that might be you're going 4 miles an hour over the speed limit, or you've kind of gently rolled through a stop sign, or a brake light is out, perhaps. I don't think the police stop everybody every time they see a light out. I don't know. But the idea is that these stops are to sort of see what's going on. And I've experienced stops like this where there isn't really anything going on, but the officer wants to see what's going on, has a suspicion about something. And it's my understanding that some regard this as good police work. Here there might be questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? Do you have any contraband, any guns, any drugs in the car? In Maplewood, we're unusual in that we require a written signature in order to perform what's called a consent search. Police can always ask a person if they're willing to consent to search. In most places, most of the time, if they say yes, then the search is permissible. They've waived anything. Here, they have to sign a form, and that's a really great practice. So again, that's another way in which we're unusual. But we're interested in thinking about that difference. In some regard, we're not always going to agree on what is good police work, but I think our commitment is to have that conversation about what is or is not good police work, and whether investigatory stops actually have any benefit at all. Because if they're happening, they increase the number of occasions for there to be conflict and tension, because somebody's pulled over and they're not really quite sure why, and they kind of resent being pulled over, and if they're a member of a minority group, they might think, hey, you know, what they've already got their back up, and the police get tense in those situations, and, you know, we've seen the results of that on occasion around the country.
Do you want to talk about the second piece too?
No. Oh, the safety piece?
No.
Yeah, one sentence. We're also interested in traffic safety.
Of course.
And there's been discussions and plans, and actually, Kasha will tell you, new police practices that do have to do with promoting traffic safety, making sure everyone's safe. So we're sort of taking a look at that as well.
I think our township committee members can say probably after people complaining about taxes, the second thing that people complain the most about is traffic. Speeding on Prospect, on Wyoming, on Maplewood Avenue, on Springfield, on whatever. So the fact is that people are complaining about speeding, they're worried about safety, and so as a thing that the police department, monitors. I think we felt like it was our responsibility to make sure, or to at least look into this and make it part of our purview when we're talking about stops, because in theory, we're stopping the right people who are speeding on Prospect and Wyoming and all of that stuff. So as I said at the beginning, we spent the first 6 months doing all this information gathering, and then we're starting to piece together what data we need and what we're going to look at and what kinds of questions we're going to ask of the data that we have in front of us. And as part of our information gathering, there's actually some pretty important history about stops and traffic in this town and safety that we have to take into consideration as we're then starting to evaluate the data. So a lot has happened when it comes to traffic in the police department in the last couple of years. First, 3 important things happened in 2018. They restructured the department, which included the creation of a new traffic bureau. So after Chief Duvall came in, he sort of made a bunch of different changes in terms of how, where police officers were going to put their resources. And as part of that, he created this traffic bureau to specifically focus on traffic. The second piece is that e-ticketing was introduced. So this is, just it's a little computer that they carry with them, so they can immediately sort of type everything that they into a little machine when they are going to issue somebody a ticket. What's good about this is that it makes everything that we need from a data perspective compulsory. Anything that we would want in terms of gender, age, race, everything. Now it's just they have a thing and they have to punch it in. Everything has to get filled out, which makes our jobs a lot easier. And I think it also makes their jobs a lot easier in terms of compliance. And then third, on the safety piece, also in 2018, Maplewood Township conducted a traffic study to assess where the critical areas were in terms of speeding and safety and things like that. So now we have a record of the recommendations that this consultant, this firm made about where the biggest issues were, so that we can then say, okay, they identified these places as the biggest areas. Are those the places that we are also monitoring the most and keeping track of? So an initial piece of data here, again, we have nothing to conclude about this because we really are just getting started. We literally just got our first files in the middle of December, so we're just trying to sort of figure out what's going on. What you can see is that there was a real increase in the number of stops from 2016 to 2018, and that's decreased a bit. Again, we don't know why that is, but at a minimum, you can see, we're talking about a few thousand stops that are done every single year by the townships. You can do the math, however many that is per day. So this is a pretty significant effort on the part of the department, and sort of a big part of what they do is our traffic stops. So as I said, we're just getting started with all of this, and you can see. So in my everyday life, I'm in market research and I work with data. And a big part of what I do is I ask questions of data. And we have a large series of questions that we'll be asking of the data that we have in front of us. So certainly we want to understand how do stops break down by race, gender, age, residence. Erin said we don't know, where these people live, specifically, but we do know, generally speaking, are they Maplewood residents or not. So we want to understand. That. Are there locations that are more stop heavy than others? And then again, how does that align with sort of noted problem areas from the traffic study? Time of day, daytime, nighttime. How does that correlate with locations? Or are there certain areas that are sort of hot night spots versus certain areas that are hot day spots? This question about investigatory stops versus clear violation of the traffic rules. What proportion of stops are we seeing in those two categories? What percentage of stops lead to an arrest? And what are those grounds for arrest? Use of force. How often is use of force used as part of a stop? Warnings versus citations. How many times does somebody actually get a ticket versus they just get let off with a warning? And then how does that break down, of course, by race and gender and age, et cetera? And then, I think finally, once we've had a chance to take a look at all of this and start answering some of these questions, I think eventually, we may end up with some recommendations for the standard operating procedure for stops. It hasn't been rewritten since 2009, which was, the previous administration of the department. So it's possible that we may, out of all of this, we may end up with some recommendations we may make to the department. Anything else you want to add? All right. So now, Julie's going to talk about training.
Yeah, so training is one of the sort of major goals we had to look at, because I think that, you know, the impetus of our board being coming out of the 4th of July incident, I know that a lot of people in the community have questions about the internal culture of the police department and, the internal culture of the police department, and some of that has to do with leadership, of course, and personnel, but a big part of that is training. So we wanted to get at what training is going on now, what do we know about it, and then eventually do a forward-looking, you know, where we see some deficits in the training and what kind of recommendations do we maybe want to make to the department going forward. So we took a look at the trainings that the MPD currently receives, and, you know, as you would imagine, most of that is sort of tactical training. Much of it comes from different police academies around the state, even though we are, I think, technically sort of assigned to the Essex County Police Academy. There's been some issues with the Essex County Police Academy, mainly it's been shut down for a while because of some issues that are out of our control. But there have been, the Maple Police have been sending out officers to other police academies around New Jersey. So a lot of those were tactical, as I said. They also include trainings on domestic violence, various de-escalation trainings about how to, you know, approach people without using force or using the minimum amount of force, not lethal force, to de-escalate a situation before it becomes out of control. There was training on community policing. There's been cultural diversity training on how to sort of recognize different cultural barriers or differences that may affect the way that you're communicating with someone. So you know, that stuff is happening to some extent. I will say that because there has been a lot of trainings that had to happen outside of the county, it's limited to some extent the amount of officers that we could send to those trainings. And one of the sort of takeaways that I got is that it's important to have trainings, as many as we can here in Maplewood if we want to get the most inclusion of all the officers in them. And that brings me to some further trainings that have happened more recently, and some of that has been responsive to some of the issues that community members have raised. So, for example, some of you may have been at the use of force report back meeting that was held around this time last year, and some of you may remember, in particular, stuck out with me. I know a lot of members of the board. There was a parent there who raised issues about what kind of training the department receives on people with autism spectrum disorder, and really, it's my understanding that in response to that question that was raised, the department organized this training on dealing with and being responsive to people with autism spectrum disorder, that was conducted by Children's Hospital in Mountainside, and I think it took place here at the Woodland. And all the officers in the department, I think it took place over a couple of sessions, but at some point all of the officers in the department received that training, and they got very good feedback from that, was my understanding. So that's the kind of thing we were able to see that, you know, they brought in the community group or a hospital in this case to conduct this training. They conducted it in town, and then you had the participation of the entire department in that training. There's also been trainings on dealing with what are classified as EDPs, or emotionally disturbed persons. These are people in mental health crisis that the police department responds to. And there have been trainings about identifying when you're dealing with a person who is in crisis, and that was conducted by the Claire Mass Hospital in Belleville. And in addition to that, that hospital is our response de-escalation. They're our response crisis team in the case of identifying somebody with an EDP. There's a mental health team from Claire Mass that comes out that responds to Maplewood to answer those calls with the police and to deal with the person who's in crisis and to take them to the hospital if that is deemed necessary at that point. So I thought that people would want to know that that is something that is in place. And so from that, you know, we've made these conclusions about what we would like to see. And I think in the next few months or year, what we'd like to do is identify more of these types of trainings that we can bring to Maplewood, bring communities in, to train officers in areas that we think that would make them more responsive to the community. In particular, for example, we've identified this training called Trauma to Trust that is conducted by an organization in Brooklyn, but actually all of the newer police officers have been participating in it, where you bring in a group of community members to meet with the police, and this is all like a meeting run by a moderator where community members get to dialogue with the police and express their concerns about policing, and it's a back and forth between the two groups. It happens over several sessions, but it's an ongoing process. That's an example, along with domestic violence training and trainings by groups representing people with disabilities. These are the types of trainings that we'd like to identify and bring in and be able to house locally, so we can get as much participation as possible from all members of the police department and get them involved.
Okay, so as we mentioned earlier in terms of our objectives, one of our objectives is community outreach. So we put this quote here, it's at the very top of the charter, and I think it sort of nicely outlines and kind of frames who our constituents are. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but certainly the Township Committee is sort of our main, our constituent. That is who ultimately, any recommendations that we have, it starts with them and it goes to them and sort of through them goes to the police department, although obviously we have DC Sally is there at every meeting to hear what we have to say, but ultimately they are our primary audience. We said too, Maplewood Police Department is also one of our constituents. So in fact, we met with a bunch of break and file officers back in the summer, and some of these non-emergency call questions were brought up. Sort of saying like, I don't know if we should be spending our time, addressing these leaf blower calls. And we said, well, maybe, that's something we can look into and turn that back into a code enforcement sort of thing. Also questions about, again, we don't have a topic here to talk about the school stuff, but frankly, some of the security training questions and the ability to get into the schools and do the kinds of drills that they need to really become familiar with the schools, that was an issue that was raised by officers in that meeting as well. So they are certainly a constituent, and we want to hear from them. But then finally, obviously, our most important constituent, I think we would argue, is the community. And so we are committed to community outreach in a variety of different ways, and we are desperate to hear from the community in terms of what their concerns are and the sorts of things that the community wants us to focus on. And so with that in mind, we have a few ways that you can contact us, but we do really want to hear from you. First is our board meetings. We meet once a month. Usually it's on the first Wednesday of the month at 7:30 p.m. at Town Hall in the small conference room. Sometimes that changes, so you do need to check the website and make sure that it is at that date and at that time and at that place. But the public is more than welcome. The meetings are open to the public, and there is an opportunity for public comment at every single one of those meetings. So anyway, you can go to the website and see what the agenda will be, and you can see the latest sets of minutes and all that. We are also happy to come to you. So in 2019, we went to the Borden Park Neighborhood Association meeting, and we went to the Agricultural Society to talk about what we were doing. And we'd be happy to do. We also met with a handful of folks in the school district. We're happy to go to any sort of group that wants us to come and talk about what we're doing and to hear their concerns. We'd love to do more of that. So you can reach out to us to ask us to do that. And then finally, we have a contact us page through our site on the Maplewood Township page. But what's important about that is that it's not just any old, contact us with your name, email, and comment here. You can actually post anonymously. So if you have something that you want to tell the public, but you're concerned about your own safety or you just don't want to, share who you are, you can post anonymously or not. You can tell us if you want us to reach out to you too. But all of that, we'd love to hear from you through that as well. We do have an important request. One of the seats, we showed you all the people that are part of this board. An empty seat is, we have an open member for a 16 to 20-year-old person of the community to join us. They're a non-voting member, but they would be a critical voice in terms of how, a big part of police interactions in this town are obviously interactions with youth. And having that representative, the reason why we included that in the charter in the first place is because we wanted to make sure that we had that voice. And yet we've had a lot of trouble actually recruiting that seat for the board. So if you know somebody or you know someone who might know someone, we'd love to talk to them. We've actually written, we've been working with the schools to try to get the word out through the school district. If you're interested, we also have a letter that we've pre-written that can be sent to parents, because we've had a couple of students who are interested in participating, and then they tell their parents, and their parents are like, whoa, what's this police board? I don't know if I want you participating in that. So we actually have a letter that's written that we can share, that sort of talks about what we're doing and what the process is like. Terrific opportunity to get some civic education, so would love your help recruiting somebody for that seat. And with that, we'd love to take your questions and comments. We'll take them publicly, but we also, again, if you want to submit anything anonymously, we have note cards and pens in the back table, so you can give them to us at the end as well. But if you've got anything, please raise your hand and get a question. Yeah, that'd be great.
One with the non-emergency calls, I was curious if people were dialing 911 or using the same number that I would use to call in guest overnight parking. And given that there seems to be an issue with strangers and people that they don't recognize that are, to our extent, I almost think my family would do better where there are less, so we wouldn't be confused. But is there anything done to the person that calls when it turns out not to be emergency at all? So the person who was called on has their life interrupted for a bit. What happens to the caller?
No.
It's probably best for DC Sally.
Nothing happens to the caller. I mean, a lot of times the
Is
caller.
it recorded?
It is, but a lot of times the caller is anonymous, wants to remain anonymous. So we will not respond back to the call. We get the call, respond to it, and resolve it there.
But we know what number they're calling from, right? Like if someone repeatedly called and said there was a fire and there wasn't,
Okay.
you could know who it was. So I'm
Yeah,
just curious if it's a
you
few
could.
people that keep calling.
That I'm not sure. I don't know if it's the same person,
Okay.
but we get calls all over the place. A lot of anonymous calls.
We weren't able to look at that
Yeah, we didn't.
Okay.
from the information that we had. We're not allowed to know who the caller is.
And then in response to your first question about whether these calls were 911 or to the non-emergency number, did we just look at the 911 calls?
No, opposite, we just
the
looked at
non-emergency number.
Okay, so
It's a separate number.
Yeah, so it's
the non-emergency police line.
Yeah, and that's part of the public education campaign, so that we can get the word out to everyone, including such callers, to not do that.
But one thing we could look into for the year ahead is, are there other, we'll start with this, the campaign here, continue to monitor the data and see how things are moving, and are there other methods that we can address with respect to people who call in?
We'll take that as a no.
There's a question. Question right here. I can't see.
Shannon?
I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you for all of your service on this work. I'm going to say that because knowing other towns and communities that have done this is hard work. I just want to acknowledge that. And the community effort and beyond that to create a board oversight committee like this in tandem with our police department and our town officials is something that is really valuable. And so I just want to thank you all for doing that first. Second, I have to say my question is as an individual and not as a member of the Board of Education. I can only speak on behalf of myself. That being said, so when the force report and some questions came out last year, I'm going to ask the same question that I asked at that time. And that is in regards to, I asked this at the Maplewood convening of that, and also when South Orange did. And that is, at that time I had asked the township and the police chief and staff that were present that day, if they had the data and numbers on how many times police have been called to our schools and for how and why, and if that number was captured. And at that time, it was reported that there's really no metric of that. I asked the same question, equally fair, to South Orange when they held the same meeting, and that was a similar reply. So my follow-up now with this, now that we have the community board, is there a way that we can also be able to collect and gather data to know how many times officers are, but since previously it was reported that it wasn't captured, that if we can have any type of data collection or knowledge on how many times police officers are requested to school or school events, and why reasoning around that. One, I think just for better transparency and oversight and to see where maybe things need better support systems. Two, for better collaboration and response, right, community measures. And three, for better community education and awareness. And less because police are maybe intervening to support youth, but more that could really amplify some youth needs in the community that we don't know need to be addressed, right?
So Shannon,
different approaches.
Sorry, is your question about when they're called to an incident or when they're requested by the school district to attend like the football games and things like that? Is it the former or the latter?
So that is a good clarifying question. So previously, oftentimes each individual school building authority in that school has the ability to be able to request support as needed, as any community member does. The challenge is that the district doesn't maintain that information and the police departments don't maintain that information. And then, so we don't know how many times they're being requested or what for. And then for events and other measures, like there was an incident this fall with the football game, and there needed to be additional support at the football game for health and safety reasons. But sometimes that's not clarified, and sometimes that can spin out into other.
So it sounds like you're including both categories.
Right.
In terms of having some sort of data tracking mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
DC Sally.
Yeah, maybe that's something that either Chief Duvall or Deputy Chief Sally could address.
That has to be tracked.
Yeah,
right?
when we respond, there's an incident number
Yeah,
for that.
I appreciate
Even when we do when we respond for open gyms at the school, that's.
Is it a manual thing though, that one of us would have to go through every call and see where you were called to?
No, we can run it by building, run it by
Yes.
our address.
I'm surprised they got that response because, I mean, they keep track of like every single car that's made. So if that's kept track of,
And I don't recall giving that answer. Yeah. Even when our community service bureau responds there, they make a case number for it. They make an incident number. Every time they respond to the school, when we call to the school, we do detail, whatever we're doing at the school is recorded.
Yeah, I mean, Chief, if we said, how many times have you responded in 2019 to 17 Parker Avenue, that's a number that someone would be able to get for us, right?
Yes.
Easily. Yes.
So we can pull,
We can ask
pull look into this.
Yeah, we can pull that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so just to follow up with that, so there have been officers that have reported that they themselves get called to schools and multiple times, but necessarily doesn't go into the ether. Like
So you mean they're called directly versus going through either the non-emergency
Yes,
or the
correct.
direct line? Okay.
Right, there's been a change recently. DC Sally or Chief, you want to talk about that? This idea that it has to go through dispatch so that it can be tracked and not calling individual officers, that certain principals or teachers have gotten used to.
Yeah.
But even when it's called to an individual officer, they're notifying dispatch.
that they're going there.
That- yeah,
So
that
that
they're
still
going.
should be getting.
They were called directly.
Right. But we try to tell the schools to call dispatch directly. Don't call the individual officer. But even if
If they do.
they do, they
Still
call
gets put in.
dispatch, and then it's still put in.
Right,
But
so
I think that we're talking about something different now. I think we're talking about when one of the teachers say, can an officer come in to assist with a class? So I've had discussions with having officers in the school to participate in other things, and I have established a protocol that if we respond to the school for any other reason, just to help out with open gym, whatever the situation is, that we stop in the office and we let somebody know so that there's clear communication that officer is not in the building without the main office being aware. So we are no longer, if this was happening before, we were no longer directly going to a classroom without somebody in the school being aware of that.
Which should be the case at all of our buildings where every visitor, regardless of what you wear that day, if you're a civilian or law enforcement, everyone should check in with the office for building security reasons. One thing, Shannon, I do want to address is schools was very much, as Kasha mentioned earlier in the presentation, was on our priority list. It's something that we do want to explore more. It's just so many hours a day, and we're just getting up to speed on data, but this should be a pretty, I'm gonna knock on wood, this should be a pretty easy pull, like the leaf blowers. Semi-easy, not as easy as
the
leaf
data
blowers.
but most importantly, the data should be there.
Yeah.
So we can add this to our list of things to investigate.
Yeah.
To be fair, if the school hires 2 officers for a dance or 5 officers for a school a play or for a football game, we don't really track that. I mean, we give the school a bill.
We're talking about incidents though, right?
No, Shannon wanted both.
Well, just
What's that?
in
In the
regards
form of we're looking to receive payment.
Yeah, and then
We
we
don't
don't,
record it as
the way
a-
that we track all pay jobs is
Yeah.
basically, yeah.
Right.
But that's not considered an incident, so that's not gonna have an incident number or be.
But we could pull the opposite way through the invoicing system though. It's all right, so if we have our lay of
But
the land.
the schools also know how many officers they request.
Right.
I mean, you pay the bills for it.
So there's a person behind
I think
Shannon.
that specifically for discipline issues, it would be helpful to see how many times the school calls the police for not, for fights. I assume any type of student with a weapon, police can be involved. But I think we don't get the numbers on when the school calls the police versus when they do it internally for their administration.
Right. What are the incident numbers versus.
And that's a good, Teddy, thank you for that, because that is a really good category we want to look into. And as Aaron mentioned, part of the work of the board is to, after looking at data and analyzing it to see what picture it creates, there's an opportunity for policy advocacy, not here in Maplewood only, but also all the way up to the AG, because there are certain guidelines that the AG issues every so often, and recently revised actually in this particular area, where the AG requires every local department to respond to school incidences, and there are a whole bunch of categories, and you'd be surprised at how broad, this area is, when teachers can just call for discipline, for backup.
One thing we know though anecdotally, again, this is something that we'll eventually get on the list of things for us to look into, is that the number of these sorts of calls have decreased precipitously over the last few years. So I think, maybe 10 years ago, it was much more common for administrators to call on the police to come in and handle something. And over time, the administration has taken control over a lot of those things and are calling the police a lot less frequently, is what we've heard. However, this is something we want to verify and look into and understand sort of what that relationship is. Again, as I said earlier, a huge part of what the police here do is interact with youth. So it's obviously important for us to understand all of that a little bit better.
So Joan has a question.
Thank you. This is more of a comment and an invitation. Given how confused so many of our seniors are about when to call the police department and when not to, I was wondering if the board would be interested in addressing our senior problem.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, great. Absolutely. Is that at senior center?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have the kitchen with snacks, so
Oh, wow.
come on by.
Oh, wow.
It's so nice.
Yeah, so Joan, we should talk and we'll get that set up.
And Joan, just because this is being recorded, can you tell everybody when the senior advisory committee meets? We meet when? When does the senior advisory committee meet?
The senior advisory committee meets on the second Thursday each month
At,
at the senior center,
starting at,
starting at 7 o'clock.
there you go.
And for 2 months, in April and in December, we're having Saturday morning meetings at the senior center to give people who work during the day, have childcare responsibilities for grandchildren while their children are working, to have a chance to come, speak with us, address us about issues. And we'd be very interested in partnering with the board on any issues involving the police, so that we can then pass along some of what you're telling us.
That was great, Joan. I love this. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I love it. Okay, Nancy. Wait, there are two Nancys here. Wait, Nancy, no press.
I want to ask, it's a two-part question, I guess, about the police cars that are kind of hard to identify as police cars. They make me really nervous, and as a woman, we've been taught never pull over unless you can identify the car as a police car. And what's related to that, and I find them ominous, and a lot of people have mentioned this, like, I hear this out and about, so I bring this to you because if this is an effort at building community and good relationships, this feels like not positive. And a related question is in people's nervousness about traffic stops, which should seem somewhat innocent or not devolve into something serious, but have. I've seen a lot of people slow down and try and be upstanders or allies or just check on people to make sure that that person who's been pulled over is safe. So there's a question I think people wonder, like, should I be doing that? Am I getting in the way of the police doing their job? I don't know what people feel about that.
I think you should be doing that. You should let the stop happen. If you're looking from afar or whatever you're doing, if you have a complaint, come in later and do an internal affairs complaint, or that worker's coming to do an internal affairs complaint. I always tell when I talk to kids that are about to start driving that if you have a problem with the stop, just comply with the stop, and then later on come in and do the complaint. Mm-hmm. Don't argue. It's not going to help you to argue with the police officer out there on the street. And most of the time, it's usually the person has a problem with the ticket, not the officer. So they'll come in, they want to do a complaint, and then once you talk to them further, you got a problem with the ticket, okay, go to the court, you got everything in court. But if it's a demeanor complaint or anything other than that, make an internal affairs complaint. Or if you're watching it from afar and you see some problems, you can come and do a complaint. Mm-hmm. That person doesn't exactly have to do a complaint. Anybody can do a complaint.
So there's two different ways of raising concerns to the police. There's the process that DC Sally mentioned would go through the directly into kind of the internal affairs channel. But just to remind everyone that the board also has a way to anonymously mention that, hey, I'm driving down Parker a lot and I'm noticing this happened, or I saw a bunch of kids sitting on the side and police officers were talking to them. It kind of happened around here. Could you guys spot check the video and see if everything was all right? And so there's two ways for it to go in. One thing I do want to say about our web portal, because we are an arm of the government, if things are really specific, it can end up through the IA channel, so just to disclose on that. Now, in terms of unmarked cars, I think DC Sally recently gave us a great example about, to Julie and me, when we were at the, we were doing video one Saturday. That's what we do on Saturday. To talk about when you stop someone in your unmarked car and how you handle that.
So I have an unmarked vehicle. I witnessed a person crossing the street. Car almost hitting that person. Didn't yield to the pedestrian crossing the street. So I pulled the car over. But what I did, I was actually in plain clothes at that time in an unmarked vehicle. So I made the stop. I have the signs on my car, I made the stop. But I waited for I asked for a marked unit to show up. So once the marked unit came in, the uniform officer came, then that's when I approached the car. So that's how it's usually taken care of. So we have unmarked vehicles, but should call for a marked unit with a uniformed officer so the person can identify who's stopped.
And is that standard
Yes.
protocol?
Yes.
I just want to say, just about observing police officers, of course, it's your right to do so, and you just have to make sure you're not obstructing what's going on, keeping your distance, staying out of the way, but it's absolutely your right to do so, and I want to say that, you know, you can, in addition to internal affairs, that we're a place that you can, you know, if you see something, it's like to hear feedback, good or bad, you know, about whatever you see.
And also, I'm sorry. Also, you don't have to come in and make a complaint. You can call a phone. So if you don't feel comfortable about coming into the department.
But I've done that maybe 6 or 7 times, and as long as, you know, you're enough of a distance away, every single time, the police officers have simply ignored me. They don't engage, they're doing what they're doing, I'm watching, I have a right to watch, as long as I'm not getting close, you know, that I'm just enough of a distance, and I guess that's just a judgment call. But I would encourage citizens to do that as often as they can, as long as they do it properly. Not, like I said, I haven't been bothered or harassed or, you know, just been ignored.
There was a question
over here, yes.
I'm Leah Kogan, editor for Tap Into Soma, which is a news site. And I just wanted to know, for any of you, did you have anything in your first year that surprised you, that you found that surprised you?
I actually couldn't believe some of the reasons people call the non-police line.
The non-emergency number?
The non-emergency line, so many things that really did not seem at all related to a policing matter. I think a lot of that is community education. I think there are a lot of things people just don't quite know what to do, so you're the default. And that did surprise me.
I think one thing that surprised me that it's the year 2020 and the state's use of force form is still a piece of paper that has to be handwritten.
It's not online.
No. And so, as someone who has terrible penmanship, I had to review a lot of terrible penmanship as well. And it's hard to see. The incident reports are typed, but the actual force forms are not. And so it raises a bigger question in terms of larger state compliance if it's a paper form, and are we truly tracking that information? It's the same form. This is the policy from 2000, June 2000, and here's the form that they use. The only difference is the word Maplewood's typed here, and this is the state issued form here. So that surprised me.
I'm told this year though.
Really? Okay. All right. I'm gonna look into it. Okay.
And I wasn't surprised by it, but I was disappointed by the bias and the suspicious person calls.
How's the question in the back?
Hi, I'm Mike Morrison, we representing, I'm a youth minister at First Baptist Church in South Orange. You and I retired from Maplewood Police about 8 years ago. Seems like a long time, but my question is, the birth of this committee stemmed from the incident on July 5th, which is really confirmation on the feeling of the youth, so really marginalized and underappreciated in these towns. And I hear what's going on. My question is, through this collaboration, is there anything being done to change those communities' perception of their disenfranchisement and marginalization from this community? Because that really is the issue of the feeling of remnants of these towns, that they have that feeling about how they're treated. So is anything being done about their perception of their community?
So yes. So the short of it is, so during 2019, one of the meetings we had with the district was to meet with the district's counseling and social worker team, so that we, as a board, and this is why we really need a youth member. Like I might start begging down the street. Like this is to get into the schools and actually run programming where it's youth led and they can raise their voice. Not us as the grown-ups, they can raise their voice and help all of us be more conscious and aware. So the structure is, I don't want to say there's a structure, there's an outline or a thought, but we really need that youth perspective going on. And I think if anything, that's one of our biggest challenges to get over right now.
I mean, we'd love to hear from people like you who are working with youth, through churches around town and things like that. Like, we would be more than happy to work with those sorts of groups too, as part of an overall education effort and a listening tour. We would love that.
Yeah, I would say just that this has been one of our biggest challenges, but also something that we're very conscious of. It's come up at almost every meeting. How do we get more youth voices involved? How do we get to the youth? How do we, have conversations with them? So it's something we're still trying to figure out, and we love people to give us input and help.
Yes. Right, yes.
Earlier, sort of discussed transparency, yet also the constituents that you have and sort of serving multiple masters. In the beginning, in the timeline, from the events on July 5th to today, it was noted the chief's resignation, but nothing of other officers. And that's something that hasn't been quite as transparent. Why is that? And is there a point at which the board or other entities say, okay, we know who was involved from the youth side, and they know who was involved on the flip side, why not share?
So for matters of personnel, we're gonna kind of turn it over to the chief I don't know if you want to address the concern of, we know that the child who is involved here, or children that are involved, but we don't know how are things handled on the department side and why or why not can information come out to us.
Specifically related to internal affairs investigation?
To July 5th, not knowing the police officers' names when I know teenagers' names and the chief that resigned, but I don't know what happened to the others. So if I'm pulled over or if I'm calling an officer, I don't know if it's that one right there.
Well, generally, unless it's involved in an internal affairs incident, that officer's name is public. So if you get pulled over by somebody or you have an interaction with an officer, that officer has to provide that information to you. If that officer is subjected to an internal affairs investigation, there's only certain people who are entitled to that information, and that is generally the complainant. And the complainant, first off, internal affairs investigations are guided by the Attorney General's guidelines, so it's not guided by the Maplewood policy on internal affairs. So it's not something that's exclusive to Maplewood, it's a state policy. So officers involved in internal affairs are their information is kept private. It's just the way it is. The public has very little information available to them as to pertaining to internal affairs. That's not a discussion that I have.
So separate from internal affairs, an officer involved in an incident who may have tried to make an arrest, that information is public? Like, I may not know if there's...
Yes. So because this is an internal affairs complaint, I cannot reveal it.
Yeah.
However, we have recently received a complaint where an officer failed to provide their information, and they were disciplined because that is a violation.
Right. So I think what you're getting at is really critical. There is certainly, the playing field is not level, right? And that is the frustration. The frustration that the state guidelines, the AG guidelines, have to change in a lot of ways at the state level so that we can have more control here locally in terms of transparency and accountability. And certainly the events of July 5th, 2016 really are a great example of that. You know, how long it took to get access to the information and before the public got to see anything, all of which was outside of our local control. But something that the public should be aware, and the chief and DC Sally can back me up here if I'm misinforming, starting on April 1st, the AG is opening up this idea of having the public receive more information about officers who are subject to internal investigations or who have been subject to internal investigations before. The matter has to have reached a conclusion in one way or another, not pending matters, but so officers in other police departments would be able to share that sort of information. And that is really a step in the right direction.
Yeah, a good access to what the
right. And that is really a big deal, because even when because we care about transparency and equity across the board, right? Not just for our town. So even if we were able to get rid of a bad cop, as it were, another town would inherit that bad cop, not knowing that they're a bad cop. After April 1st, that's going to be harder to happen.
And it's not like we shelter that person. That officer has due process rights as well. It's not like we shelter them, because remember, the person who made the complaint knows who that officer is. You know, we have no ability to stifle that person. So if that person feels like they've been wronged and they release the officer's name, there's nothing that we can do to prevent that. Okay, and sometimes that happens. So in other words, maybe the public doesn't know necessarily the officer's name, and there is a due process portion of this. But the other person knows who the officer is. So that information is not a secret to them, right? So it's not like nobody knows. People do know.
I think we have time for, there's another event coming in here. And thank you for that critical question, and also Chief for explaining all of these, because this is, as you guys know, this is a common, it's almost 4 years after July 5th, and this question, it still seems unresolved. So we need to keep getting to the resolve. We have time for maybe one short question, because there's an event coming in here at 4, and I don't want the police call on us to get kicked out.
I just have one comment, just to remind everybody, and definitely you all, since you're looking for youth input, that Tuesday is the district's school security and safety community town hall forum. I believe the police chief's going to be there as well, students, as well as Dr. Taylor, the board of other folks, to talk about safety, security, and all that stuff within our community and the school. So that's.
And Shannon, will that be on Academy Street at the district building?
Yes.
Okay. Starting at what time?
7:30.
7:30.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thank you.